Hello.
Hello.
I'm Alex.
I'm Val.
And we are here to talk about Season 4, Episode 6, Everybody Hurts.
We are.
Which I loved. I loved
Good.
this episode.
I love when you love episodes.
I just think it's such an amazing episode. So it's this.
Better than when you're bored about episodes.
Well, that never happens.
Did.
When?
With
Christopher. That's like my Noah Tenenbaum.
And this is another Michael Imperioli episode, so it's surprising that you know, you go from Christopher being so bored to this one being so excited.
Yeah. I mean, I love Michael Imperioli. I think he's an amazing writer. And this episode, it's really, yeah. I just think it's a really interesting case where we examine one aspect of Tony. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of thrown into this situation that's kind of a standalone episode.
Yeah.
Like the things that happen here don't necessarily come back that much. I can't actually think of
Yeah, it
anything.
It closes a lot of them as it opens them.
Yeah, I don't know if I can think of anything that's pushed forward in the arc of Season 4 in this episode. Can you?
No. It's pretty standalone.
Yeah, which is interesting. And I think that what happens in that is that we really get to dive into Tony's guilt and Tony's feeling of who is he? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy?
Lots of people in this episode say he's such a good guy. He's a great guy.
He's seeking it out.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that everything that Tony does in this episode is trying to put himself in situations where people tell him what a great guy he is. And I think that it's really interesting because his way of coping with Gloria's death is that he goes inward and he questions if he's responsible for it.
Yeah.
And so then he acts in a very specific way where he's trying to get positive reinforcement from other people. The interesting thing is that as people are brought into his orbit, they actually kind of fall down even as he's trying to help people up, be a positive force, he actually really brings them down. The impact that he has on Artie by quote unquote helping him is pretty catastrophic.
Yeah, totally. And we've seen him help people that way before too.
Yeah, but I feel like never to this extent because he's so torn up and psychologically distraught that he is in a position where he feels like the only thing he can do to remedy this depression that he has is going out of his way to help people. I was thinking about how if Artie was in this situation at any other time in the show up until this point, Tony would not help him like this. He would not just give him $50,000 and give him 1.5% juice. It's just not something that he would...
Juice.
I think that's what they say in the mob. Juicing it? It's like the interest. It's the juice, Val.
Okay. I'll trust you on that.
Listen, I get a lot of loans from the mafia, so
Yeah.
I know a lot about juice.
The juice.
I don't think that Tony would strike that deal. I feel like he's upset that Artie, his friend, went to Ralph Cifaretto and asked him for money. And when he goes and he meets him, you know, he's saying... What am I, a toxic person?
He says that twice in the episode.
He says that twice in the episode. And I think that's like really a key line. Like he's afraid of that.
Yeah.
He's afraid he's a toxic person and he is a toxic person.
Yeah.
The fact that Artie is brought into the events of Tony Soprano and borrows money from him, it actually really is toxic. It actually really does bring him down.
Yeah.
And that's what happens throughout the course of this entire show.
Yeah.
Everybody who is attached to Tony, there is this toxic element that really ends up bringing them down.
Well, it's interesting, like, his focus on blood, too, like, in the past couple episodes, like, focusing on Christopher and the fact that he's blood, right? Because, like, if you think about, like, I don't know, like, toxicity or whatever, like, genetics, right? Like, that there is this kind of, like, toxic element when it comes to blood, right? Like, things can be passed down
Interesting.
through blood and, like, I don't know, like both Chris and Aid using that needle to do drugs. Like, I don't know, there's something about blood and toxicity.
Well, there's definitely a link between Christopher and AJ made very strongly at the beginning of this episode. In fact, we see Christopher on heroin, and then there's this cut to AJ in his face.
Yeah.
Like right away. And the question, I think, is, well, who is AJ going to be?
Yeah.
And actually... At the same time, it's who will Christopher be? Will Christopher be Tony's son?
Yeah.
You actually see Christopher High meeting Tony in the parking lot. The last scene they have is like hugging each other as Tony basically states his plan to pass off the business in the Empire to Christopher because of his blood relationship. He's essentially making him an underboss. And then we cut to AJ, who's so detached from this world. Like, all that I can interpret from that is that Christopher is more Tony Soprano's son than AJ is.
Yeah.
And I think that he is seeing him that way, and he is respecting him and passing off the business to him because he sees him as a son.
Yeah.
And the question is that, well, will AJ become somebody like Christopher, like a ne'er-do-well, when they're editing between Christopher doing heroin? Is this going to be something that AJ becomes, like a problematic character? Will he be drawn down in the same way as Christopher? And I think one thing that was really interesting in this episode was the use of mirrors as a symbol, because there's a lot of characters that we get to see reflections of.
Yeah.
And some characters are even straight on looking at reflections of themselves. And I think that the mirrors reflect who people actually are.
Well, we
in this
see
episode.
Christopher, Artie, and Tony all looking in mirrors.
Yes, exactly. And we see Christopher in a mirror as a junkie. Like, he's with this random guy. He's done the drugs. He's looking at himself, and it's really like the spitting image of a drug addict.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we are dealing with in internalizing who Christopher is as a person, because he really is kind of going off the deep end right now.
Yeah.
And Christopher is dealing with it because he's looking in the mirror, and it's something that's out of his control. Even as he moves up in the mob and is getting these advantages and promotions that are probably beyond his wildest dreams from even a few episodes ago, he has this uphill battle because he really is becoming a junkie. Mm-hmm. So who will he become? Like, will he be the son figure of Tony Soprano, who is actually capable and responsible enough to take on this business empire? Or is he just completely falling apart?
Right.
And the objective reflection that we're getting is that he's kind of falling apart. And so I think that's really problematic. We have
versus Artie, who we see, he's like trying to portray himself as this like tough guy, right? Like, he's like looking at himself in the mirror being like, you French frog or whatever.
Yeah, nice place.
Yeah.
Which he repeats like verbatim as he gets there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good pair of scenes, but like that, we know that's not who Artie actually is, right?
Well,
and so
it's
like
obvious.
At the end of that scene, we see him kind of like sink into a chair and just be like,
yeah, and even like what the mirror is reflecting is somebody who's not at ease in that role.
Yeah.
Like, he's this bumbling character. He's not really capable of doing this.
Yeah.
And it's made very obvious through the reflection.
Yeah.
And the shot that we get shows us that.
Totally.
We can see it and he can see it. Also, interestingly, and I'll talk about this very briefly after I go through the 3 examples of mirrors, but he's wearing all black right there. And actually, there's a lot of really intentional usage of characters wearing all black in this kind of like tough guy role.
Yep.
And that's something we've talked about a lot. You know, you often see like Furio going as an enforcer wearing all black, but like Artie is kind of taking on that role. And actually, there's a lot of people wearing all black earlier, like when he's with Tony. Earlier in the scene where Tony first says, "Am I a toxic person?" and he offers the money, Tony comes in wearing all black, and there's actually a scene where Artie puts on a black shirt near the end of it.
Right.
And he's kind of drawn into this orbit.
Yeah. Well, and in the end, it is Furio wearing all black who goes to take care of the French guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many examples. Even the suit that Brian gets at the end is like so jet black we can't even see it. Really.
Yeah.
I think there's all these things that Tony's bringing. In his first session with Dr. Melfi, he's wearing all black.
Yes.
And I think
she's wearing beige.
Yeah, and they've established this a lot before, and they've played with who's wearing white, who's wearing black. In fact, Artie is a character where they've really played with the like basic symbolism of whites and blacks.
Yeah,
but
a lot.
It really shows up here, and we have him when he's kind of trying to become this enforcer, tough guy character, putting on that color.
Yeah.
And also putting it on when he accepts Tony's money.
Yeah.
And he is completely out of his element.
Yeah. No, he has no idea how to do this. And then the other reflection we have is Tony, right? Like, he's looking at himself in his reflection after the dream he has.
There's even another one then. Yeah, I didn't even have that. I had another reflection.
Oh,
so
okay.
I'd love to hear this.
So here's the one that I have. It's after his dream, and he's looking at himself in the bathroom mirror, and then he takes Prozac.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
What's the other one?
Yeah. The other one is Tony to Artie in the bathroom of Vesuvius. So Artie says, the money's not going to be here. And Tony says, get your arms around it. And he says, have you gone to visit him? And he says, no. He says, well, you got to go visit him. Like, it's so basic to him. And again, we're reinforcing who Tony is, and we're reinforcing who Artie is. And Artie is completely incapable in this realm, in this domain. And Tony is, I mean, this is like beyond simple. It's like a joke to him. He's just like, you just go there and get the money.
Well, then that's interesting because for both of those characters, not really for Christopher, but for both Tony and Artie, we get kind of like two conflicting messages there. Because like, so for example, like it's like Artie trying to be this tough guy versus Artie who's like clearly not a tough guy, versus Tony who's like in control and knowledgeable in that bathroom scene, compared to the scene where he's like clearly super distraught and taking Prozac.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like those are two different images of him. I mean,
Yeah.
both are probably true.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how like it's not reflecting the same thing to them.
Totally. And also the connection between Artie and Tony, where in the end, Artie is also with pills. Like the way that they're kind of like casually tossed onto the kind of like table next to him really reminded me of the empty Prozac containers that Tony was taking from.
Right.
Earlier on when he was looking at himself in the mirror. So Tony has kind of been responsible for bringing down Artie to where he is.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that's what he does. Melfi even comments near the end saying, well, I'm surprised because isn't like usury a main part of your business? And I think that Tony is kind of confronting that a little bit and trying to avoid it by putting himself in situations where people are telling him what a great guy he is. Artie tells him, you're such a great guy, Tone.
Yeah.
Brian tells him, wow, you're a good guy about the suits. There's more examples even.
Yeah.
Because Tony is seeking out this affirmation that he is a good guy, where really he's not.
Yeah. I like when Carmela tells it, like when she tells him the news of Gloria's death, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I forgot that it's Carmela who tells him that. And then she perceives him lying there quietly, right? As like he doesn't care. She calls him, look, Mr. Empathy over there. Right. And so like it is this kind of like, depending on where your perception is, you can see different things too. Like she can't see or know what he's actually feeling.
Yeah.
And in some ways he does, like he's maybe not empathetic, but he definitely is distraught by this.
I feel like he's struggling with issues of his empathy. Mm. He wants to feel empathetic, and I think he's just like incapable of really engaging with those feelings. I think he's trying to be empathetic, but what happens is he just brings people down.
Right.
As far as he is.
Yeah, no, you're...
Because he is a toxic person.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think in that dream sequence, there's that, well, maybe we could talk about it, but the end of it is the ceiling crumbling.
Yeah.
And like, it's like getting in his drink and it's whatever. It's kind of just like you can only kind of hold up this facade for so long, right? Like that then it starts to crumble. And it's the same with Christopher. It's the same with Artie, right? Like you can't hold up the facade of being something that you're not.
Right.
Because it will kind of like come crumbling down on you.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. I think another example of Tony getting together with somebody the other time that he called himself, what am I, a toxic person, is when he's meeting with Janice.
Yeah. And he's like, what, I gotta have an agenda?
I know, to meet with my sister.
What am I, a toxic person?
Yeah. Which we would have to believe he does have an agenda because every character in this world is essentially only acting through self-interest and always does have an agenda. And it's actually a very interesting connection to the last episode, to Pyomai, where that was a main theme of the episode and something we talked about a lot, how everybody does have an agenda. And when people are interacting, there's this kind of underhanded manipulation to get what people want.
Yeah. No, and I think like it's interesting, like Artie saying, you know, when Tony comes to see him at the hospital and he has that very like melodramatic moment, like the cobwebs are now removed, right? Like how Tony sees things 20 moves down the road and positions him as this hawk, and like it's said a few times, like, and then Tony repeats that back to Melfi, like being this hawk. I think it's interesting to think about that in the context of our other like animal references that we have, right? So like, you know, what is a hawk to a duck, for example, like, or, you know, and comparing what that might mean.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what happens in that scene that's really interesting is Artie calls out Tony, and that's when he freaks out.
Yeah.
Where basically he establishes that he was thinking of him as this like very competent manipulator, but a manipulator. Somebody who understood everything. And it's really interesting because that's when Tony freaks out, because what he wants is reassurance. And that's what he's doing in all these situations. When he goes to see Artie, he has some really interesting lines. He even says, like, consider I came over and I find you dead. How am I supposed to feel? So that's a good example for me of Tony being so incapable of feeling empathy and how everything does need to loop back to him.
Yeah.
His frame of reference is that he is the center of the world.
Yeah.
Which kind of reminds me of that little scene confrontation he has with Meadow this season, where Meadow says, you're not the center of the world, and then there's kind of a pause, and we have to kind of question that, because for Tony, he is the center of the world.
Right.
And for us as viewers watching this show, Tony kind of is the center of the world. But for Tony to go into that situation and deal with Artie's possible suicide as a question of how he would feel is completely devoid of empathy. And it's only when Artie kind of calls him out and says, oh, you saw this, you were manipulating it. Worst case, you got some free food. That's when Tony kind of goes nuts. And that's when his anger comes into play, because all he wants is people to tell him you're a good guy, which Artie was doing.
Yeah.
But now that Artie's been pulled down and Artie makes the mistake of being honest with his friend, there's a big issue.
Right.
Because he's not reinforcing a positive image of Tony.
Right.
He's basically calling it as it is.
Well, we know that Artie has other information on Tony that's pretty damaging too, right? About like Vesuvio and stuff like that. So like, I don't know why they're still friends. That's one thing I don't really know how they kind of got.
They go
over
back
that.
a long way.
They go back.
They're
a long
high school
way.
friends.
It is interesting with Artie. I know we're kind of like talking about a few things at the same time, but in terms of those like two images of someone or multiple images of someone, when we see him approach Ralphie for the money, the scene is shot in this really strange way where like it's kind of shot like it's like a down low shot looking up at Artie, and he like kind of fills up the screen.
Right.
Like his head is
kind of forgotten
at the top of the screen.
They have a really like wide angle actually.
And it's like shot from low, and then like Ralphie's kind of shot from a little bit high. It's like there's not shots like that throughout the rest of the episode.
They make sure to have the Devils logo always associated with Ralphie.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
Again, a very strong Devil reference, of which there are many in this show.
Yeah, they really like that one. But like Artie does come across as like he's like pretty relaxed. He's going to this meeting, right? Like he is kind of in control when he's asking Ralphie. And I mean, I'm always shocked when Ralphie does anything that is like the least bit endearing, and he's he doesn't want it. He says like, if you don't pay me back, I can't hurt you. Yeah. Which, it's beautiful, really. It's so beautiful, yeah.
What a great guy. He's a great guy.
Everyone says that. Ralphie.
Yeah. Well, the thing I was thinking about in terms of the arrangement that Tony cuts with Artie is that in the end, even when he goes to the hospital and before Artie kind of unloads on him his real feelings, when we kind of sit back and reflect on the deal that's been made, Tony gets a $6,000 credit to the restaurant, and he assumes the debt, even though the debt was supposed to be $51,500. Tony just made money on his friend who just committed suicide because he just assumed a $50,000 debt, which he's going to get.
Yeah, well,
very easily.
His money already, right? Like,
I mean, he's going to have no problem getting that $50,000 through his enforcers in Furio. Yeah. That's a very different story. Jean-Philippe doesn't stand a chance. Like, they will find a way to get $50,000 from him. Then a $6,000 credit, he actually pocketed $4,500 more than Artie even owed him. And that's when Tony is smiling and feeling like a good guy, and Artie's like, oh, it's good. And everything's kind of left to be happy. But all the information is there. Tony just manipulated this for his own gain and is also, requiring that he's being made to feel like a good person. And he's getting that, even though he's manipulating Artie and making money off of him. Right. Which is kind of wild. Yeah. I was finding it rather like when Artie is saying, how is that going to work? They've already pumped my stomach. They saw the Armagnac. The fact that he drank Armagnac and then had all these pills is like a little bit of like a Greek tragedy or something. It's like a little strong.
Well, he's being pretty dramatic there. Like I said, like that whole line, like the cobwebs are now removed. He's such a weirdo.
Yeah, it's pretty strong.
His earring gets ripped out.
Poor guy.
I know, it's good. I'm glad that happened for him.
It's a better look without the earring, right?
Yeah, I think so. But no, it is. Like the Armagnac. I was trying to think about like what that kind of symbolized, this Armagnac, for them. It is this like Italian, or I guess French.
French, yeah.
European, I meant. European kind of thing, right? Like which does hold this kind of like romantic notion for these characters. And so
I mean, for me, I think Artie is just seduced by the romance of being a cool business guy.
Yeah, well, and he loves young women.
Yeah, he sure does.
So
God, Artie, get it together.
I know.
It's interesting that they kind of cut from that scene in the hospital, too, where Tony is left not feeling like a good person. And they cut to this dinner scene with Furio and Carmela.
And Jessica.
And Jessica and Brian.
Yeah.
So, and Tony's telling this incredibly sentimental, romantic story. And
a blue dress.
The blue dress, which is interesting because actually Tony wears a blue shirt at the end in Melfi's therapy session, which is a little bit unusual for him. And I feel like he's just kind of trying to establish himself as being outside of those monotones of the mob. He's trying to establish himself as being associated with this color that's like a more human, emotional thing that's not in the kind of black and white world of the family.
I feel like blue is more like in the mob and like money and stuff. I don't know.
The blue?
Yeah.
Well, the blue is associated with finances a lot in the last 2 episodes.
Yeah.
In Pio Mai, actually, when Tony is getting financial information, I think we just talked about this, but he has this like very blue shirt. There's this blue dress. There's a lot of relationship to blue.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I feel that like when Tony shows up to a therapy session and we're examining his subconscious and his psychology, and he's wearing something that is like a stark, rich color.
Yeah.
That is actually an intentional decision and not something we see that often.
Yeah.
A lot of the time they're these muted colors. And I think it often in this show is reflecting what he's trying to communicate or how he's trying to represent himself.
Yep. Oh, totally. No, he definitely makes choices about how he wants to be seen.
Yeah.
He wears actually like a variety of different clothes, Tony.
Yeah.
We see him like compared to other characters, we don't see everyone wearing this like real range of clothing.
Totally.
But we do see Tony. We see him from like very casual in his boxers, and undershirt, all the way up to like wearing a fancy suit, right? So like it's quite interesting, and a whole range of colors.
Yeah. So the interesting thing that happens in the end of the episode is in Melfi's therapy session, he talks about how two suicides was too much.
Yes.
And he said, fuck them, basically.
Yeah.
And his takeaway from it is that
they can go fuck themselves.
They can go fuck themselves,
Yeah.
which is a very interesting reference to Gloria Trillo.
Right.
Where there was this talk about her fucking
going to
himself
fuck
and
herself.
her being a snake and all
Yeah.
these things that were happening in the last season.
Yeah.
Which is actually very, like, unempathetic. The fact that he can just kind of throw that back is actually like really revealing and interesting. But he basically says they can go fuck themselves. I made a donation in her name, and he seems to be okay with just kind of moving forward from this. I feel like that's where we leave the end of the episode.
Yeah, I mean he's so furious with Melfi earlier in the episode, right? Like we have 2 sessions with Melfi today. And the first one, like he's already found out about her suicide, and so he really confronts her in a really violent way. She says she's devastated by
she says, I give my patients everything I've got, and when this happens, I'm devastated. Which is fascinating because that is something that Melfi can say, but Tony can't.
No.
Melfi gave Gloria everything that she had.
Yeah.
But Tony did not.
Yeah.
He turned his back on her.
Yeah,
and then when she killed herself, he's left with feelings that Melfi would not have and should not have.
Yeah.
And yet Tony is still the one who's blowing up at Melfi.
Yeah.
And kind of like holding this against her.
Yeah.
So.
No, and then in that last scene of them together, you're right. He is kind of just like, well, whatever. Like,
yeah. And the cycle continues. We see Furio show up at the door of Jean-Philippe, and we're just back to the same shit.
Yeah.
It's just we're left exactly where we started, which is a very classic Sopranos.
Yeah, and again, like kind of why this is a standalone episode, right? Like it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Doesn't, like this, like the suicide of someone who you once dated, your best friend, ostensibly committing suicide. It like leaves zero impact on your life in the end.
Yeah.
Right. Like it doesn't make you recognize your culpability in anything.
But it could, and I think that's the thing. It's an opportunity for self-reflection.
No, that's what I'm saying. But that's this show, right? Like it's like. And now we're just back where we started. Yeah. It like didn't do anything, right? Yeah. Like at all.
And but I mean thing is, this episode examines that area where Tony has the opportunity to change or make changes and reflect. And he does reflect, but then, it leads nowhere.
Yeah, it's that big question that we've talked about before that's like an overarching show question, which is like, who is Tony and can he change?
Yeah. Is he a good person in any way?
Is Tony a good person at all?
And I think that for me, this episode is really fascinating in setting up what happens near the very end of the show when... Probably my favorite episode, when Tony goes to Las Vegas, and we'll get there in weeks.
Yeah.
But there's kind of this examination of Tony as not a good person.
Yeah.
And kind of leaving the show on that note in some ways, and kind
Yeah.
of examining some of those questions. So in this episode where Michael Imperioli as a writer is really examining, well, is Tony a toxic person? Or is he a good guy, like people are telling him? And Tony striving to be a good person.
Yeah.
I think that is a contrast to what Tony lands on in terms of his identity for himself at the end of the show.
Right.
So, yeah. I think,
also, just the end of the show. It's like a oven timer, but it appears it's in the dream, and then it's in their real life, and it reminds me of the last episode.
It does, yeah.
There's
and
this,
I love that.
Ding.
Yeah, when the cookies are ready, the bell.
Yeah.
Which ties Tony to his subconscious and the dream.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's a really interesting scene. That was actually another example of somebody being so happy by what Tony was doing, by being good guy Tony. Carm saying, "You've made me so happy, Tony, by signing this trust."
Yeah.
So clearly Tony is just doing things for the sake of making other people happy.
Yeah, and then Brian thinks he's a great guy because of that. And,
I mean, he got a sweet suit.
Yeah, he loves Hugo Boss.
It's his only vice.
You know Brian. What about the whole AJ storyline in this episode? I think it's really funny. I don't know. I struggle to kind of like integrate it with the messages of the rest of the episode. So I'm not sure what you think, but...
Seems like somewhat isolated, like it's just like a different trajectory.
Okay. I like that his friends reference, like, it's this whole thing, like, them grappling with, like, AJ's friends kind of, like, teasing him in some ways about who his dad is. And, like, intrigued by who his dad is. They make, like, they talk about the Godfather and, like, the horse head in a senator's bed, which is interesting in terms of Pyomai.
Yeah.
Also, like, to reference a horse head. They talk about, like, we thought it was going to be, like, Michael Corleone's compound and guard dogs and whatever. And clearly, like, that's not AJ's life, right? And he knows that.
No. And hilariously, there actually is more of a compound at his girlfriend's place.
Sure, yeah. Her house is...
There actually is a gate and, like, an entrance.
And guards and stuff like that.
Picassos. Late Picassos. Her
dad collects late Picassos. And he's, like, kind of, like, he goes from, like, thinking he's kind of this cool guy and, like, he's sexy and, like, I think she's ready to have sex with him. He's, like, talking to his friend to feeling, like, totally inadequate.
Right.
Right? And, like
he's emasculated by her opulence.
Yeah. Which is interesting because, like, everyone has this image. Like, it kind of goes back to, like, the mirror images and stuff like that. Like, his friends and her have this image of what Tony Soprano's son would be like, or what the Soprano home would be like, and the reality isn't the same as that.
Yeah,
obviously it's still opulent, but
I feel
the
like
$3,000 statue.
That's a really
is
interesting
not like
statement.
The Picasso the Picasso paintings.
No, and the fact too that like Carm says, I don't even want to say how much it was. It was $3,000.
Yeah.
Like there's something kind of she lacks elegance in her need to state how much something actually was.
Yeah.
That actually reinforces her not as being as upper class as these other people who the late Picasso collection is just like not even a thought. Aren't you afraid that we're going to steal these millions of dollar Picassos?
Yeah.
No. It's just casual.
Yeah, but it's interesting when they go, like, so when AJ and Devon head into the city to try to have sex in Meadows' dorm room, which is like, ew. Like,
yeah, what the fuck, dude?
Yeah, this is like, why would that be an option for you? I don't get it. But like, they have that conversation like after they're in the South Bronx and they leave and they're like, look at how people live. Like,
I also love how that's about 5 blocks away from where we live and are recording this podcast right now.
Yeah, it's basically where we're recording that podcast. But yeah, like they have this kind of, you know, quote unquote deep conversation in the car. So deep.
They're all on food stamps.
Yeah, and
they just keep on having babies and
they
being
keep having
in a cycle.
Babies, yeah. It's really, you know, it really just does show like how removed that is. Mm-hmm. And yeah, like, you know, and AJ I think sees things differently, having gone to see where Meadow works. I don't know, like it's just like this like Meadow has this deeper perspective on things now that she's away from that orbit, but AJ is still really in that orbit, and so
absolutely
he's not really able to see beyond that yet.
Definitely. And I think that's something that both Meadow and AJ continue to grapple with as the series unfolds. Mm-hmm. You know, how tied are they to the Sopranos orbit, and who will they be as people?
Right.
And even this episode is examining who will AJ be, you know, by linking him to Christopher and also bringing into question the status that he has and his family has.
Yeah.
And how it exists on a spectrum, and they actually are not that wealthy in a lot of ways.
Yeah, what does Devon's dad do?
I don't know. Something better than Tony does, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think that it's also... Devon. I think it's also like a comment on the fading importance of the mafia. Like, I think that the Michael Corleone heyday of Godfather and Godfather 2 is kind of past, and Tony has now been surpassed by these capitalists in a lot of ways where he can't keep up, and there are people who are way richer and way more important and way more powerful than he is.
Oh, totally.
Even within the same community.
Yeah.
You know, let alone having like senators in your pocket.
Right.
It's just not really the case.
Well, he does have a senator, I guess.
Tony?
Yeah.
Zellman?
Yeah.
No, he's just an assemblyman.
Oh, just a council. Oh, assemblyman.
Oh, yeah. Man. See how much they've fallen?
Yeah. But he could put a horse head in his bed.
AJ doesn't even have a home in Tahoe.
Yeah, that's true.
I just have some loose thoughts about some different scenes in this episode.
Like what?
One that I really loved is some of the choices as Tony enters Globe Motors. Motors.
They really focus on the Mercedes symbol.
They do. Yeah.
They like zoom in on it.
Mm-hmm. So some of the camera work there was really amazing, I thought. And actually, so this is an episode directed by Steve Buscemi, written by Michael Imperioli, who obviously plays Christopher. Pretty amazing. It's a cool combination of kind of people working at that level, because Michael Imperioli and Steve Buscemi are like not the classic Sopranos writers and directors.
Yeah.
And some of the episodes that they're involved with have a slightly different flair, for me at least.
Yep.
And so having them together is cool. And I like the way that it all comes together in this episode. So when Tony's walking into Globe Motors, there's this kind of fading back of the camera on Tony as he enters. So we're kind of like continually getting further away as he comes in and is looking around. As he meets with the salesman, it's really interesting the way they kind of block the scene.
Yeah,
so the salesman kind of like
half ahead for a lot of it.
Well, the salesman actually kind of like confronts Tony. He actually like pushes into his space. He kind of comes up. So there's this kind of pull and then push back.
Yeah.
So we're kind of falling back from Tony and then pushing in on him. And there's an interesting way that actor who plays
the
Mercedes salesman number 1.
Yeah.
He plays the scene and would have been directed to play the scene, because there is something kind of confrontational about it. And the way he states some of his lines, at least my interpretation.
The way the whole thing is exposed,
saying she was unlucky with men. There's something about, for me at least, there's a way that he's almost challenging Tony. There's this kind of like break of logic, or of the kind of like rules of what would actually be happening in realism, where this character is actually almost like challenging Tony Soprano and knowing that he's responsible. That was how I interpreted it this time. He's pushing into him, and the way he talks about everything is just kind of very confrontational. Which was just interesting too, the feeling of space that they would kind of like be pulling back and then like imposing on the space that Tony has around him, which is a very rare thing. People don't typically do that, which is why it stood out for me in particular.
Interesting.
People don't typically challenge Tony Soprano. And even though it is kind of a normal conversation and he's just saying what happened, there is this other element to it that I found really interesting. So anyway, I really loved that. I thought that was super interesting, and I thought it was great. There was also kind of a link with the dreams and the Prozac to Isabella in the first season to me. Another episode where Tony is very depressed.
Yep.
And kind of comparing his lethargy at that point to his feelings of trying to make other people happy in this one.
Yeah.
So how does Tony deal with depression? And there is this
we
kind of...
often see him in these scenes, like looking in the mirror and taking Prozac. We've seen that before.
Yeah, totally. It's kind of becoming a bit of a symbol. But for me, in particular to that episode, there was like a strong link of like the whole episode being structured around Tony as a depressed person.
Yep.
Because we haven't had that much.
Well, and the dream that he has of Gloria is really nice. Like they're like kissing and they're...
Other than the like scarf holding her head on and her asking, do you want to see...
This or this?
Yeah, this or this.
No, but like, you know, like they're like... He's having like warm thoughts of her, right? Like he's not... I don't know. And kind of like he had in Isabella. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to describe it. But
yeah. No, I understand.
And then the ceiling crumbles and it's bad.
Then the ceiling crumbles and he chooses to see her broken neck and it's beautiful.
Yeah, she's wearing that really long scarf.
Yeah.
It's creepy.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I
had a favorite line of the episode.
What was your favorite line?
I like when AJ's in the car with his friends and they're trying to go to the Bing.
Yeah.
Which is on Highway 17.
I don't know, it's by Lodi or something.
In Lodi. But they didn't make it there. They went to the pork store instead. And so I love the line where they say like, oh, this is the pork store. And one of the friends goes, oh, it's a gay strip club? Which I think the pork store would be a great name for a gay strip club.
The pork store.
The pork store.
If any of you guys are investors, we have a great idea.
We should have named our podcast The Pork Store.
Maybe we can from now on. Well, keep your eyes open for a rebranding.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just had some really small things like another example, Tony, when he's talking to Janice, is another situation where he just wants reassurance. Like when Janice has stories of her own, even when Tony specifically asks her about, did you ever know anyone who committed suicide? Right. James Gandolfini as an actor, if you like watch his eyes, they're just like glazing over as soon as Janice says anything. Yeah. The only thing that he can really engage with is when Janice is talking to him about him and his feelings.
Yeah, totally.
He's just completely incapable of taking in anything that Janice is talking about, and he just doesn't care. Yeah. So it's another example of, it's another place where he said, am I a toxic person? He just wants her to say, you're a great guy. Yeah. And to an extent, she does. She says, even though we fight sometimes, you come through when it counts. Right. And Tony's happy. Right. So it's just another example of him searching for that in this episode. Yeah.
The other thing for me, and it happened last episode, and, I kind of forgot about this part of the storyline, really, but, Chris keeps mentioning it, Tony did something really big for him, right? How, Tony gave him the name of...
Barry Haydu.
Ostensibly the guy who killed his dad.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's an interesting one as, Chris's kind of, motivation to keep doing what Tony... wants him to and stuff like that. Anyways, I forgot that it kind of came up again and again, because Tony did something big for me.
Yeah. Which is interesting and manipulative of Tony because we never even really had closure on if that is the right guy.
No. And so again, it's kind of like Tony's a great guy.
Such a great guy.
Yeah.
Only other thing I have is cigarettes versus cigars. Yeah. Ending the last episode on a cigar, Tony with a cigar.
And then he takes Chris's cigarettes out of his pocket smokes them.
Yeah. And there is a feeling of being out of control when we see Christopher, at least for us as the audience, and knowing all the facts that Chris is high on heroin, came here and Tony is, trying to pass off the whole business empire. That's a very precarious situation. Yeah. And when he grabs his cigarettes, his instability, and smokes them, for me, it is this kind of loss of control. Yeah. Because typically I feel like people smoke cigarettes at times where they are not fully in control. Yeah. Like Artie, when he goes to meet Jean-Philippe out back, he's smoking a cigarette the entire time.
Yeah, exactly.
So, another use of that symbol.
Yeah.
I love this episode. I think it's amazing.
Cool.
I think Steve Buscemi, Michael Imperioli are awesome.
Everybody hurts.
Everybody hurts. Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah. So, if you've been enjoying the podcast, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can always rate and review in the iTunes store. Helps people find the podcast. We always appreciate it. And we'll be back with more Sopranos podcasts. We love doing this, and we look forward to continuing through season 4.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening.